Some moments define a nation, some moments test it. Tonight in Geopod, we discuss those very moments. I'm shivaneethapabasnyat. For democracies, transitions are milestones. For states, they are moments of risk. Authority fragments, uncertainty expands, and hesitation carries a cost. Nepal is in one such moment, in a world less tolerant of ambiguity, especially for small states. Tonight on Geopod, we're not discussing politics. We are examining authority in transition. And joining me is security analyst Jianzheng Thapa, and we begin with a simple but uncomfortable question. Is Nepal managing this transition, or simply moving through it, hoping for the best? Welcome to the show, Mr. Thapa.
Thank you so much.
As an expert of security, as you are, from security perspective, transitions are often moments when authorities is shared, borrowed or contested. Let me come to the very core question. Who in Nepal today holds the authority to decide, act and enforce? And where does that authority become uncertain?
First of all, thank you so much for having me on your show. Second, let me begin with a disclaimer. So I'm not here, I don't represent any groups or organizations, so whatever I say here are my personal viewpoints. The second part about my disclaimer is I'm not here to tell you the truth. I'm here to tell you, share with you my perspective. Because as you know, truth has various gradients. Your truth, my truth, the absolute truth, the temporary truth, right?
And multiple truths.
Multiple truths. And so I'll just share with you some of my perspectives based on my education, my experience. So in terms of transition, the transitional authority, I think we need to first examine where authority is derived, at least from a state-centric perspective. There's a constitutional element to it. There's sometimes a legal element to it. Sometimes there's moral authority. But most of the times, state has something called the monopoly of force. The social contract between the governed and the government is derived from that social contract. And the social contract usually has that element of force. At the moment, I think the way we need to look at it, whatever happened, the Zenzi revolt and the subsequent government that was formed, I think you were trying to ask me about that. So if you examine that process, the way I think we should look at it is internally, I think the government has been accepted. Internationally, it's been recognized, but constitutionally, it's not recognized. So that's the state of authority of the government at this point. The monopoly of violence or force, I think, still rests with the army and the security forces because they're still existent, they're still functional. But there's this very ambiguous nature in terms of who authorizes the monopoly of violence. The best way to describe that is the position or the portfolio of the chief district officer, right? Because we have debated, discussed about the Zenzi revolt, and we've always questioned who actually authorized the police to fire upon the protesters. And the accusation or the allegation has been leveled against the CDO. So there is this ambiguity and that level of question mark, especially in terms of where does the CDO come in and whether the CDO is actually recognized by our constitution or not. So there are these blurry lines, but there are also these distinct features such as the internal acceptance and the international recognition.
How much ambiguity itself is a risk to vulnerability to a state, Mr. Thapa?
It is because it's based on acceptance. The way the state functions is whoever governs has to have a majority acceptance rate. The majority has to accept whoever governs. So that social contract is derived from the acceptance by the governed. At this point, it is very difficult to tell because we cannot calibrate what is the level of acceptance at this point. There was a revolt. There was apparently an online selection process. We don't know how it was done, but there was a distillation process that brought a candidate to the fore, and that person was selected and was later appointed as the prime minister. And then that prime minister went on to select few other ministers. So that has been the process. For example, the previous entities or people that were part of the government have repeatedly said, some of them have recognized it, others have not recognized it. I think that's the status quo at this point. But like I said, internally it's, I think, more or less accepted. Internationally it's been more or less recognized.
So a lot of water has flown after all those episodes that we were witness to, right? If you look around, just to pan through, there's a lot of caution in the air.
Sure.
Amongst, in and around all these stakeholders. So just out of curiosity, what does the security lens say? At what point does institutional caution stop stabilizing the system and rather, weakens it?
If I got your question right, you're asking about how the institutions are looking at the situation.
How
right?
much caution is okay for a system to work?
I think caution is not the right word. I think preparation is the right word for a system, because when you look at a system, the system prepares for these scenarios, anticipates change, and anticipates the threats that bedevil our system. So the institutions are built to anticipate these changes, these upheavals, these also look at the opportunities that actually arise from the contextual changes. So I think the best way to sort of describe the institutional framework in terms of anticipating a future is preparation. Are our institutions prepared for it? To a certain extent, some of them are, some of them aren't, I think. But the most prepared and the most endowed institution is definitely the Nepali army. We saw that quite clearly during the Zenzi revolt as well. The level of professionalism, the level of restraint, the level of mobilization, and the level of outcome that was that we witnessed was unprecedented. One thing that I can basically attest to is the fact that the Nepali army has always been our crisis manager in every single crisis, and it has gotten us out of all these crises. If you go back to 2015, during the blockade, it was the military diplomacy that got us out of the blockade. And right before that was a major earthquake. The army deployed within 30 minutes because everyone was assembled at the army headquarters when our bureaucracy was missing, our political class was missing, every other entity of the government was missing, but the army, along with two of the sister organizations, came to the fore. COVID, if you look at COVID was a massive crisis for us. The army got us out of that crisis in multiple ways, all the way from dead body management, because it's not the role of the army to do dead body management. It shouldered that responsibility because no one else was willing to take it, right? It was a very scary prospect, but they shouldered that. But the one thing that basically tells us, even during COVID, that the army became the most reliable institution was when the three major powers, the ambassadors, the envoys of all three major powers, were hell-bent on providing their assistance to the army chief rather than to the Ministry of Health or the Prime Minister's office. The Chinese, the Americans, and the Indians would not give the COVID assistance to anybody within the government, but only to the army chief, because they said, if we don't give it to the army, this assistance is going to go to waste. Then fast forward to the Zenzi revolt. The level of professionalism that they demonstrated during that episode is something that the world is studying today. Not a single bullet was fired during that whole episode. Not one looting, not one excessive use of force. But they got us out of it within like 48 hours after all that took place. So I think army as an institution, I think I've always maintained that they're prepared better than the others, but also they also have a lot of gaps, I think, in terms of, especially in terms of the capability gaps. The army, I don't think, has been provided vehicles for the last 7 years. Our air assets were quite lacking in that front. So, but overall, I think it's the preparation.
The kind of picture that you portray right now, not everybody shares the same view, right?
Sure.
So if you could shed more light on this, where exactly or when exactly a line is drawn as to when to act? Because in situations like this, there is always this big dilemma for any state or for any institutions as to when to act. Sometimes earlier action causes consequences.
Sure.
Sometimes a delayed one causes consequences. So what is there anything in black and white that draws that line as to when that action should begin?
It's about decision making, right? This whole process is about when do you make the decisions and what do you make, what brings you to that decision point, I think is the main question. So when the state or the institutions act, they act on certain premises. For example, assumptions. They're based on assumptions. And they're also based on options, right? So the way the decision making is made, at least at the government level, is you have certain assumptions, you have certain options, and there are consequences to all of those options or those assumptions. So whoever decides, ultimately decides based on these three variables. The other part about decision making is we as humans, we make decisions almost on a daily basis. For example, my decision to come here to give an interview is based on a certain assumption and based on a certain consequence. But those that are part of the greater strategic decision-making circle, they need to have that level of training, that education, that experience, so that they are able to decide on our behalf at those critical moments. And the decision-making is always, I think, based on it's on accountability as well. You have to be accountable to the people, and it has to be proportionate, right? And also cost effective. So every decision has a cost associated with it. You cannot make a decision that will cost too much to the state, to our treasury, not just in terms of the money, but also in terms of the outcomes. So there isn't actually like a finite way of decision making. It's just based on these three variables, which change because the assumptions can change, the consequences can change, and the options can change. So it's really depends on all of these factors combined. I think the cumulative result of all of this.
Who ultimately decides when restraints give way to intervention? Is it political leadership or is it the security command? What does a standard practice or our national policy premise say?
So usually there's something called a national security culture. Every state should have one. We unfortunately don't have one. There's something called a National Security Council, which is right across from this studio. But it has remained dormant for ever since, meaning we don't have that national security culture. We did appoint a national security advisor some months ago, but then he resigned, and that's the end of it. The policy making, the decisions are basically it's a two-way streak because decisions are based on the assumption and the options provided by the security institutions. For example, the Prime Minister is not going to be aware of everything that happens in the country, so he has to be fed by the system, and the system is the institutions that actually gather that and analyze it and then present it to them. So it's a two-way streak. I don't think it's the Prime Minister is calling the shots all the time, or it's the security institutions bulldozing their agenda. So it's, I think, somewhere in the middle. I don't think it's a finite, distinct line in that. But in a democratic society, it's always the elected officials that ultimately are supposed to call the shots. Based
apparatus together, right?
Yes.
That's exactly what you meant. Now, from the security doctrine perspective, was this restraint again a deliberate strategic choice?
I mean, it's very difficult to sort of come to a conclusion because we don't have evidence in terms of what actually happened behind the closed doors. But from what we witnessed on that day, I think it was a strategic choice that was made, strategic restraint that actually enabled whatever happened after that, consequently, because There were a lot of ambiguities. From what I've heard, the decision making was not, at least from the Prime Minister's level. For example, what I heard was the Prime Minister was advised that this was coming, so a curfew at an earlier hour possibly could have avoided that. Him going on the national television basically apologizing or owning to that particular incident, the prior incident. And more than that, I think it's the failure of the intelligence apparatus as well, and the political circle, especially the Prime Minister and the people in the government, not subscribing to the intelligence reports that were fed previously, saying that this day was all forthcoming, one way or the other. From what I know from my sources, I think the army and the intelligence had at one point, or had been telling the government that we could be facing another round of revolt or this kind of episode, since we had seen some things that happened in Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh. So it was going almost like a full circle, and it could eventually come because there was a lot of resentment, a lot of grievances, but it seems like the people did not heed to those intelligence reports, and this is what we saw. But I think going back to what you asked me about restraint, I think it was a strategic choice, which if you look at it now, has enabled us, especially you and I, to sit together and have this interview in this manner, or else I don't know what would have happened after that. I mean, I'm glad to see that the studio still remains intact, whereas some of the buildings were burnt in the front, I think. But that was a result of a conscious choice that was made by the Nepalese army and the manner in which they mobilized. So thanks to them.
So you as a security analyst would term it a strategy gone right?
I would say so, because I think there's been a lot of allegation, especially against the army, saying that they were not able to safeguard or protect a lot of these vital installations, why they were not able to do that. I think we're asking the wrong question. The question we need to be asking is, how could an army of a third world country operate in a manner where they were able to stabilize the most destructive episode in our national history within like 48 hours? Give the power back to the civilians, stabilize the situation, and not have any other untoward incident after they stabilize the situation. How were they able to do it? What allowed them not to have that power lust? What allowed the soldiers not to be trigger happy? What allowed that level of restraint and professionalism after such an opportunity, which landed in the chief's lap? Meaning, had it been any other country, which we have seen in Africa, the power has been grabbed by the military leaders. But how is it that a country or a military of the size, the scope, be able to deliver this unprecedented sort of outcome? This is unprecedented in terms of global history. And as far as I know, many militaries around the world today, and I can tell you with utmost confidence and conviction, that they are studying the Nepalese army's stabilization effort throughout the world. We're just asking the wrong question. Because yes, there were loopholes, there were shortcomings, of course there were. But overall, the outcome they were able to deliver to this country is absolutely unprecedented.
Fast forward to today, this moment, Mr. Thapa, when the nation is gathering itself, rising from the rubble or from a complete reset mode to gaining a little momentum, right? From security point of view, certainly planning is ultimately about prioritization, because if you prioritize everything, none truly becomes, right? So if you were advising the state today at this moment, what would you identify as the strongest, most serious security risk during this phase of transition?
So, there's a saying that Nepal has always been in this perpetual loop of transitions. So the first thing is, the risk is always that we will go into another transition. That's all. There's always a risk of that. But I've identified a few risks which are both internal and stem from external context as well. The first one is internal discord. The level of polarization that has taken place or is about to take place may bring us to a whole different level of threat landscape. So that's number one, the internal discord and polarization. Second is international influence, international imposition, and international intervention. That is something that we want to avoid at all costs. Influence is always there because of the money they give, because of their power, because of their leverage. Impositions do take place, but intervention is something we want to avoid at all costs. Because on that fateful night, had the Nepalese army failed to stabilize, the consequences we know what the consequences would have been. There were international forces ready to be dropped in and take over, right? So that's something we need to avoid. The other part is international isolation, which is something we need to avoid at all costs. We already know that visa restrictions are already happening because of what just happened. We need to avoid that international isolation because we need access to the world. The more access we have, that brings us more security. And international investment. We don't want international investors to, divest from our economy. We want more people to come in, invest freely, and we want more international investment to come in. There's also this thing I'm sure you've heard about, FATF. We're already on that gray list. We need to avoid getting on that blacklist because we're in this transition phase. Everything is, sort of not steady. So hope the government focuses on that because if we get on the blacklist, then we're going to have a lot of difficulties. During transition, when the authority has eroded, there's always this element of criminality that comes in. So we want to avoid being a safe haven for criminals, terrorist groups, or any other nefarious groups that may be inimical to our national interest or the national interest of our neighbors.
How do you see this? Are the quieter structural risks being overlooked because visible unrest commands attention?
At this point, we do have a very combustible external environment. We also have a very combustible internal environment as well because the society is polarized in multiple fault lines. So we have, we have religious fault lines, we have regional fault lines, we have political fault lines. So the number of fault lines that afflict this particular nation and at this particular point are quite a few. And it comes also at a time when our public security system is at the weakest. Let's not forget the day when all our police personnel were, driven out of the police stations, chased out. Their guns were looted. Still, probably 500 still out in the streets. The inmates escaped. Almost 14,000 of them escaped. We still have to bring back almost 5,000. So that's the context that we're currently operating. So that brings about a massive challenge that we have not sort of endured ever in our national history. And it's even worse than the time when the Maoists were there because on a single day, the level of displacement of the national police and the APF to a certain extent was massive. But there's also a good side to that story is in Bangladesh, a similar thing happened. But in Bangladesh, the police did not show up for almost a year. And the number of policemen that were killed after the uprising, they're estimating in thousands, right? So that public security system completely collapsed. Whereas in our case, the police, one of the most iconic pictures was this traffic policeman who came for his duty in his civis, right, in his civilian attire, because his uniform had been stolen or robbed, and he's doing his duty in flip-flops. That's the situation. Our police is back on track, but we also have a lot of shortcomings. The Nepal police is, I think, has a huge capability gap because for the police, it's about response. So when you ask the police to come, they have to respond, and for them to respond, they have to go to the place where the incident took place, and most of the vehicles have all been torched. The bikes have been torched. So now they have a huge capability gap in terms of response. And that's something we have not ever been able to fulfill very quickly. Even if you look at, from a public security point of view, the biggest risk is a traffic accident. The number of lives that are lost due to traffic accidents are the highest. At this point, most of our traffic policemen are in a very vulnerable stage because there's no traffic outpost for these guys. So they're in the middle of the street. They remain quite unprotected. So that's still, ongoing. But coming back to the police, I think their capability gap needs to be addressed very quickly, especially in terms of vehicles, in terms of other, equipment, gadgets, training, of course.
How do you weigh this, the street mobilization versus the institutional paralysis? How is this going to have a toll on the authorities at this point of time?
If you look back at our history, we have had these upheavals in the past, but we have not witnessed anything like this before, because we drafted a very inclusive, what we labeled it as a very inclusive constitution. But there are loopholes even in the constitution for scenarios like something like this. And let me give you an example. A prime minister can be changed if the prime minister dies, if he resigns, if it's voted out of office. But there's no scenario where a prime minister is chased out of his office or has to flee in a helicopter by a mob or by a crowd which is unhappy. So and then how do you sort of address that constitutionally? So I think there are these, as Donald Rumsfeld once used to say, we live in a world where there's known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns, right? So I think we as a nation, we as a state, we need to have better preparation for those known unknowns and the unknown unknowns, because the more prepared you are for these unanticipated events, I think you can address them. So that level of scenario planning, that level of, but it all comes back to the national security culture, developing a national security culture that actually is constantly looking at threats upon our nation, planning and informing our system, saying like, these are the threats that we're anticipating, we're enduring, and allowing people in the government to sort of be abreast about what's actually happening within the country and outside the country as well.
We're discussing the nature of the event and the transition, the event that led to this transition, very unprecedented, maybe not calculated at all by the state or any agencies, right? And one of the major characters was how digitally driven this was, and then a sort of a leaderless public movement. How does this change the state's traditional calculus of control and response? How do you think now the institutions, the major stakeholders will rise up to this occasion, because we are almost not even halfway through this transition?
One of the things that the state has to prepare for is to take into account that we as human beings, we as nationals now inhabit two different spaces. One is the physical space, and the other is the digital space. We have footprints that you can see, but we also have digital footprints that we need to be prepared to, sort of track down. So I think that's the context that we'll be operating in. And the digital domain is a lot more critical now, because your wealth, my wealth, is not in, the denominations are in data, right? So data is a big part of our national security architecture. We need to protect and protect our data infrastructure, because our wealth is, for example, if you have 1,000 rupees, it's now in data. If someone with the ability to sort of intrude that infrastructure and erase that data makes you vulnerable, makes all of us vulnerable. So I think the state needs to plan, prepare for that, contingency that we now live in a dual space world where digital domain is also a very critical factor for every single human being.
How much are our institutions equipped to track and trace these footprints, and also to add to track to understand the crowd dynamics of unidentified leadership? How equipped are we?
In our case, we are quite primitive in that front. Our cyber, we've always been sort of lobbying for something called a cyber command, where we look at the cyber-related threats from a very unified point of view, where we bring the Army, the police, the APF, the intelligence together and come up with a very integrated form of cyber threat identification and threat mitigation sort of approach. It's not there. Police has a cyber bureau which looks pretty much at crime when it happens, but it's very it's not preventative. So it's more like a response point of view. If your system is hacked, then you, as someone that has been whose data has been compromised, you'd go to police and report, and then they'll take action. But we don't have it in a manner where it is viewed from a national security perspective, saying like, what are the threats, cyber threats that could affect us? For example, I think yesterday or the day before, we heard that the National Election Commission's website was hacked, right? I mean, we're holding elections next very soon. The threat of someone intruding or our systems or altering our systems in favor of someone or against someone sort of completely distorts the outcome. So you can see the threat that sort of lies in front of us.
We are at the moment looking forward to the House of Representatives elections, right? And elections most often are seen as political solutions, and especially at transitional periods like this, certainly it's treated as an exit from uncertainty. But for security planners, they are also pressure points. While becoming an exit, can it also amplify risks?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. I think the best way to look at elections, I think elections are events that are periodic. So, it's a cycle. It's not something that comes and goes completely away. It's periodic, so it's cyclical. And you need to understand the dynamics of what elections are all about. Elections are competitions, right? Between contestants, they're contestants, and they're competing for something. And what are they competing for? It's votes. And why do they compete for votes? Because those votes will sort of take these people into halls of power. And once you get to power, you have access to the treasury, you have the authority to make decisions. So it's a very critical commodity that everyone is vying for. And so inherently by nature, elections are supposed to be a competition. Competition can always lead to conflict, right? Any incidents can spiral out of control and sort of evolve into a crisis. So that's the dynamic of elections. But then we also need to take into account what elections have delivered to us in the past. We've had several rounds of elections, and if I may submit, we've probably had 16 governments in the past 16 years, right? Has that brought about stability? Probably not. So we've gone from one level of instability to another. And in fact, we have almost tried every concoction, political concoction in that spectrum. The right with the left with the center with the right. Every single permutation under the sun has been tried. And even the last permutation with the Nepali Congress and the UML, the two largest parties, which at one point was thought inconceivable, we saw that. And we saw what happened, right? So elections, I don't think will necessarily, what's the best way to put it? Will not necessarily bring about, good outcomes or sustainable outcomes. It can actually amplify risks. And the process of election is also a very risk-laden process, because if you look at it, let me lay out some of the risks. Clashes between contestants, ballot box looting, harassment, extortion, abduction, killings. These are all inherently part of that election cycle that we may witness. So any of these events or incidents can easily spiral into crises and much bigger risks. So the way I look at it, as you rightly pointed out, elections may be leading us to a more legitimate, sustainable way forward, but it can also create that level of risk if any of these incidents sort of flare up into crises. This time it's going to be even more vicious because the level of polarization is extremely high. And let's not forget, elections are when people invest. You know, there's campaign financing. You have to invest. If you're a candidate, you cannot just go and, you know, you need to print posters, flags. They cost money. So it's a heavy investment for a candidate. So, and the candidate always tries to win the election because he's heavily invested in it, right? So that level of competition is even going to be fierce this time.
Yes, this brings me to the major matter, the political parties. When political parties raise concerns about election security concern beforehand, right, should institutions read them as early warnings or political messaging or both?
The security institutions have to read into it anyhow because those are the candidates that are going to be competing for elections. But when they say it's an insecure environment, you have to read it. How would I read it? I would read it as their own personal insecurity, looking at the context, because most of the older political parties feel insecure to go back to their constituencies because we've heard incidents of them being chased away or not being unwelcome. So that level of insecurity is there. But there's also, I think, financial insecurity because campaign financing requires, someone has to contribute. So how many people are now willing to contribute to the campaigns of these older political parties? That's also a question, right? So the physical insecurity, the financial insecurity, and the insecurity also relating to one particular episode of the revolt is the guns and the inmates, because most of the guns that were looted have not come back. We've not been able to bring it back into our fold. So that creates an insecure environment. But also the number of inmates that have escaped, criminals. So that creates a more insecure environment for possibly for some of these candidates, maybe not for all, but the institutions need to read into that and plan accordingly so that they can instill that sense of security so that they are able to go into elections without fear.
Mm-hmm. As you said earlier, this is not the first time Nepal is experiencing transition. We've passed through several transitions, prolonged ones and transitions of many other natures. But this one is happening or unfolding in a far harsher international environment, right? So from a security perspective, which assumptions about Nepal's strategic space no longer hold today?
The assumptions that we are shielded by two giant powers no longer holds true because there's another power as well. Because at least the perception, at the perception level, our people feel there's a third power that has intervened or that has fiddled around during that revolt. So we are no longer shielded by just these two superpowers. The second assumption I think that no longer holds true is the fact that we only have physical borders. We also have something called a digital border. So because of our digital domain, we also have a digital border that we need to protect. So that no longer holds true. And I think the third one is the fact that the assumption that all the Nepalese reside within the Nepalese territory, that no longer holds true, meaning the voters. So we have elections, but a large number of our population resides all over the world, right? So Nepal is not just within Nepali territory, but Nepali nationals being all over the world. So that assumption that Nepal is just here no longer holds true, I think, because both in terms of a voter perspective, but also in terms of our national security perspective, because the security of our national is paramount. And if you have such large number of nationals that are residing elsewhere, if anything untoward were to happen to them, the obligation of the state does not end at our borders, because it transcends that. It's, whatever happens to our nationals in the US, in the Middle East, in Japan, Korea, we need to step forward. So that assumption that we are only bound or obligated to the people in Nepal no longer holds true, I think.
And is non-alignment still a protective posture for Nepal, or has it become more porous?
I have a completely different viewpoint on non-alignment because I don't think it's no longer an option for us. It never was. I think non-alignment is something we as a nation, we were very good at putting up a facade, saying that we are part of the non-aligned movement, we are non-aligned, but let me try to sort of not necessarily negate that, but paint a more clearer picture of non-alignment. We are the only country on this planet whereby we allow our nationals to serve in the armed forces of 2 nuclear countries through an agreement, and you know who the 2 countries are, right? The Indians and the Brits. So for the Brits, we've been doing for hundreds of years. We have something called a tripartite agreement, which allows men to also be in the Indian Armed Services. Name one country on the planet that has this kind of agreement, right? If you look at alliances, alliances are usually military in nature, correct? There's no military alliance whereby a country is sending its nationals, allowing its nationals to don the uniform of a different country. We allow that. We actually have 2 countries that have military bases within the country. The Indians have a military base. They have their camps in Pokhara. The Brits have in Pokhara and Dharan as well, in Kathmandu as well. So that whole facade of non-alignment, I don't think it applies to us. We've never been a non-aligned country. In fact, we've always been a multi-aligned country, but we have propagated ourselves and positioned ourselves as a non-aligned country. I mean, people may not agree to that, but that's actually a fact. And just in addition to that, the Indians have come up with this new global outlook called multi-alignment, which Jaishankar has pronounced. They've also said we're going to be strategically autonomous. I don't know how that works. Autonomy and alignment I don't know how that goes together, but I don't think non-alignment is any longer an option for us. It's never been our actual reality, but we've propagated ourselves as that.
Now, as ground shake here in the domestic front, much is evolving around us as well. From warfares to day-to-day living, everything is like evolving and changing in a spearheaded manner, right? So this brings us to the last and one of the most important questions from the security perspective, Mr. Thapa. What kind of the world do you as an expert see Nepal is actually transitioning into, and if our institutions are prepared for that world?
I've always wanted to answer that question. It's usually said that we have transitioned into a multipolar world. I don't buy that. I think we have moved into a non-polar world. There are no long. Let me explain it. I always say there's South Pole, there's North Pole, and there's Nepal. We're a pole of our own because we're so unique and so different, so many ways. We are a pole of our own because we're the only country on this planet where we have annoyed, aggravated, or angered almost all the nuclear countries at the same time. So we are of a different breed. But the world, I think, that we're transitioning into is a non-polar world, which is very combustible, very volatile, very fractured. It's almost like a Hobbesian world where it's nasty, brutish, short, solitary, poor. Because if you look at what is happening all over the world, it's almost transitioning into that. And if I may tell our viewers, I highly recommend everyone to watch the Canadian Prime Minister's speech at the World Economic Forum. And also the fact that I want to mention, there's a saying, you're either at the table or you become a menu, right? You're on the menu. There was a World Economic Forum meeting where I don't think we were represented. So that, I think, is something we need to aspire to, and we need to plan for that. So it's a very volatile world that we're transitioning into, because everyone is out for themselves. The global power of the United States has almost recoiled. It has a whole different set of priorities. The global order, as we used to call it, the rules-based global order, I think is degenerating into a global disorder. Are the big powers going to, subscribe to the rules-based order? Probably not. The UN system has become completely toothless, so that multilateralism, collective security, the idea of collective security almost is eroding faster than we can, think of. So it's a very difficult world we are transitioning into, and we need to plan for it. Hopefully our leaders will have that level of dexterity to navigate these tumultuous waters that lay ahead of us.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Thapa, for coming over, sparing your very valuable time and lending us that expert security analyst lens to understand the dynamics around us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
What emerges from this discussion is clear. Transitions are dangerous, not because change is happening, but when authority, timing, and perception fall out of sync. Nepal's challenge is not the absence of stability, but the discipline required to manage exposure, internally and externally, in a far less forgiving world. That is the security test of this transition, and that is it from Geopod this week. Goodbye.